So it must have been about 25 years ago that I was performing with the Bestelers Theatre Company, performing in Australia in this really cool theatre in Melbourne. And the audience was kind of on three sides of the stage, so that in the interval, the audience had to walk across the stage to get to the bar or to the toilets. And so we built this tradition that every night, as you're walking across the stage, if you wanted to, the audience could come up to us and tell us some stories, like, the whole show was us telling them stories and they could tell us some stories. And one night, a woman came up to me, very, very tall woman with this straw hat. And she told me this story, that when she was a child, which is about 8, 9 years old, her father took her to the beach, to the seaside. And her father said she was allowed to swim on her own, but she had to be really, really careful not to swim out too far because he was worried she might get caught in a riptide. I don't know about them very much, but in Australia, riptides are some really nasty undercurrents that can just pull you down and leave you to drown. So, of course, she being a normal child, totally ignored her father and swam out a little bit too far and got caught in a riptide. So, absolutely terrified, she's screaming to her father that she's caught in a riptide. He swims right out to her. But about 10 feet away, he just stops, doesn't come any closer to her, doesn't come to save her. And all he does is he says to her very loudly and very firmly, "Rest when you can, swim when you need to. Rest when you can, swim when you need to." Now, as a child, she was absolutely furious and terrified. She's still splashing around, saying to her father, "Why don't you just come in and save me?" And all her father does is he keeps his distance and says, "Rest when you can, swim when you need to." So after a while, she does take on board what he tells her, and she rests when she can, and she fights the current when she feels she needs to. And then eventually some cool surfer comes by on his surfboard, picks her up on his surfboard, and takes her off to shore. And for weeks, she is furious with her dad, and obviously completely in love with the surfer boy. For several weeks, she doesn't even speak to her dad until her mum takes her aside and says to her, "Your dad did exactly the right thing. Because if your dad had swum straight up to you, all the way up to you, he would have got caught in the riptide as well, and then both of you would have been in trouble." And his advice was the best advice that you can have when you're in a riptide, because a riptide, basically it exhausts the swimmer who's always fighting against the rip and then gets pulled away. But if you rest when you can and swim when you need to, then you manage to maintain your strength for when somebody like the surfer comes along to save you. And then this tall woman with her straw hat looks down at me. And to this day, I'm now not all that clear whether she really existed. I kind of call her the Australian angel, because she looked down at me and she said, "And you know what? Ever since then, I've realized that my dad's advice is useful not only when you're fighting a riptide in the sea. Any kind of emotional trouble that I've had in my life, any time when I find that life is just a little bit too much, I remember my father's advice. Rest when you can, swim when you need to." And it's probably the case that nowadays the entire world is kind of stuck in a riptide. And I, at least, try and hold on to that advice from the Australian angel. Rest when you can, swim when you need to. This story has been brought to you by Tales from the Hill. I'm Robbie Gringras. This has been filmed and put together and edited by videographer, photographer and artist Neil Mercer. And as we always say, if you have a request of a story or somebody you'd like a story to be dedicated to, just write it in the comments. Keep it together.